Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. It's always such a pleasure and an honor to talk to the people who are out in the world actually working with America's youth, actually working in our most needy and underprivileged school districts, trying to help the next generation of scientists and mathematicians and scholars become fully actualized in that work. We need them so badly, and we need you. So with that said, I'll jump straight in. I've titled the talk this afternoon, Solving the Frankenstein Problem, because we oftentimes, when we bring the evidence base to education, so-called, scientific basis for teaching practices, for the decisions we make in pedagogical contexts, we tend to focus on small mechanisms and parts and pieces of knowledge that are really important for kids to master, that are really relevant for particular kinds of disciplinary contexts or knowledge bases. And of course, those things are very important and interesting to scientists. That's how we think. We've been trained, and it's very advantageous for us methodologically to divide the world into mechanisms and pieces and parts, and to examine those in ways that hold everything else constant, right? And to really kind of narrow in and focus. But what I'm going to argue is that that kind of evidence base has very limited utility in the kind of work that you're going to be doing. What you're doing is not improving executive control and phonological decoding and mathematical computational capacity. You're actually teaching a whole child, a whole group of whole children, young adults, adolescents, to think in ways that enable them to do science, in ways that enable them to build capacities to be a scientist. You're enabling them to think not just about mathematical concepts and numbers, but to engage with those in an active, civically oriented way that enables them to give back to society with their knowledge. You're focusing on the whole person, not the Frankenstein monster with all the little pieces. And so I'm going to talk to you about how the data really teaches us new perspectives for understanding and appreciating the importance of the whole person in the educational context. And of course, you're a whole person too. Teachers are also human beings. And your role in the context of a classroom is not simply, in this view, a sort of transactional one where you're the knowledge holder and the students are the knowledge receivers. You know a lot, they don't. And your job is to impart that knowledge at them and them to ingest it, assimilate it, and be able to spit it back out, potentially with critical, in critically analytic ways, right? But actually what you're doing is much more nuanced and, I would say, developmental than that. It's not so much, I'm going to argue, only about the learning as the outcome, right? What kids know is not the only outcome you're interested in. I would argue that what kids know, what kids learn, is the means, not the end. You're learning in order to achieve a greater goal, which is the development of the person as a scientist, as a mathematician, as a thinker, as a civic agent. And so when you situate the learning process in that kind of developmental trajectory, as an educator, your view is vastly broadened. You're not focusing only now on what can kids do and what do they know, but instead on how are kids knowing? How are they doing? What does it feel like subjectively to think in this context, in my class, in the world? How are the young people under my care in my classroom experiencing the process of thinking like a scientist, thinking like a mathematician, thinking like a computer scientist, thinking like an analyst, thinking like a person who brings their values, their beliefs, their identity, and the stuff that they've done before as fodder into new problem spaces, the curiosities they develop, the dispositions for thinking about the bigger and broader ideas that undergird the smaller computations and calculations and evidence that they're gathering. How do you facilitate those processes in the young people? Because those will endure. Those are the developmental processes that don't just teach kids what they need to know, but help them position themselves as a human being who has a desire to know, who has a need to know, and who will have the capacities and dispositions to go on with the work long after you are done interacting with them directly. So with that said, I start the talk with a painting by a colleague of mine, Margaret Lazari, who was the chair of the Fine Arts Department at USC before she retired a few years ago. And in this painting, Margaret, which in real life is like a huge 6 by 8 foot watercolor with vibrant colors, but in this painting, Margaret has taken some of our neuroimaging data, actually, what we would call white matter fiber tract data, right? So what we've done is taken a picture of one brave woman's brain while she laid in our MRI scanner, and then we've taken that picture and peeled off the outside all of the cortex, all of the neurons and cells that do the firing, right? So we peeled them off the picture, not off the woman, just to be clear. And then what's left underneath are these massively interconnected sort of little tails of salt water that are shooting electrical signals in these incredibly complex networked patterns that are dynamic, that are shifting with experience, with adaptation, with growth and development. And that represent the sum total of the integrated network that makes a human a human. And what I love about this painting as a place to start the conversation is that Margaret hasn't painted the sum total of those literally billions of little tails of salt water that are synapsing on average onto something like 200,000 others, right? But it can be anything from 1 to orders of magnitude more than that, depending on where that tail of salt water is situated in the nervous system, right? She's painted those not kind of in a bucket in the corner where we can slice them up and dice them up and look at all the little parts and modules and pieces and analyze from this observer's perspective. What she's done instead is painted them into a seascape of life. She has them literally sort of floating and sloshing in an ocean of vitality, where it's being held up and washed back and forth by the tide around it, by the little currents that you see represented by the swirls underneath it. She has little weeds poking up underneath, tickling it. She has the warm yellow sunshine on top shining down, and the little red fish swimming by to represent the spontaneity of our creative ideas. And this is how I want you to understand and begin to think about the nature of the brain and the nature of the brain as an organ for learning. We are not isolated inside our own skulls. We are, in fact, deeply interdependent in ways that give emergence to all kinds of potentials. In other words, biologically speaking, culturally speaking, socially speaking, cognitively speaking, developmentally speaking, we are interdependent on one another to co-create one another's environment for neural functioning. Literally, we depend upon the others, just like the ocean here is sloshing us and bolstering up our brains. We are the ocean for one another, and we are also being sloshed and bolstered by those around us. And so what the biological sciences are now showing, which is incredibly I think important for educators to understand, is the very deep and profound nature of our biological interdependence and the emotional and social realities of that biological dependence. So for a long time, it was assumed that kind of human beings kind of grow and develop, in ways that are natural and then and genetically programmed, for example, and then along comes kind of culture and sort of pokes on you, and education, and kind of gives you some opportunities to do things, and that changes what you can do, but it doesn't really fundamentally change who you are. And what we're now starting to understand with many different examples is that that is not the way that human beings develop. We are literally biologically adapting ourselves in real time to the opportunities that present themselves, and we are doing it in ways that are accordant with or aligned with our own subjective emotional perceptions and experiences of the social and emotional value, the cultural value of those opportunities. And so, to just kind of bring this home with some examples, many of you will have heard of the Human Genome Project, right? Which was a massive international effort, unprecedented at that time effort to try to map every gene that went into one human being. And when you read the two Nature papers that bookend that project, right? The first one basically says, we're going to get all new kinds of insights into the nature of health and disease, the nature of development, of individual variability, of genetic legacies, right, of evolution. And the next paper basically says, we're done already, right? It turns out that humans have about as many genes as a goldfish, and far fewer genes, orders of magnitude fewer genes than many plants. For example, rice plants have far more genes than a human being, and yet they don't do calculus, right? They don't invent engineering or religion or novels, right? How is it that our genes produce the minds we have? They don't. Basically, our genes are a kind of contingency plan. They're a set of tools that can be used by the individual, unfolding in context to build things, to build ways of being. And so the genes are a piece of the toolkit, but how people think and feel is directly organizing their mind, their brain, and their health over time. Another really famous and very tragic example of the extent to which we're so biologically interdependent on one another comes from, Romanian institutionally raised children from some time ago, right? So there was a famous, now ongoing study of institutionally raised children in Romania, where Chuck Nelson and Nathan Fox and some of their colleagues did a study in which they, basically it's heartbreaking to read the science paper that explains this method, but they basically, parents were bringing their newborn infants to these institutions to be raised for a variety of political and socioeconomic reasons. And so the researchers found as many foster families as they could, and basically picked babies' names out of a hat and gave as many as they could to foster families, and then the rest were left in the institution where their parents had left them. And then there was also, of course, a group who were being raised by their biologically families. But I think we thought going into that children raised in a setting where they had enough food, they had toys, they had beds, they had diapers, they had each other, they had the stuff that children need to be able to grow, what they didn't have was what they also had was a kind of a rotating staff of caregivers, adults and nurses coming through every 8 hours and then rotating back off on the clock, rather than a family who were invested in them, an adult, at least one, who was truly available to them, bonded with them, and someone who had the capacity and the inclination to kind of bring them along and show them how to be a person, right? Show them how to grow, how to develop. And under those circumstances, you don't just get children who are kind of, cognitively delayed, emotionally dysregulated, socially awkward. You get, 16-year-old kids who are 3 feet tall, right? Whose brains are a third the size of the brains of their peers who were raised in foster families. Our biology is dependent upon the social conduits, the emotional and cultural situatedness of ourselves, our bodies, and our minds. And that is actually why teaching is so critical for the future of America's youth and all of the world's youth, is because you have chosen to put yourself in a position where you have the opportunity to build relationships with young people that, if you will, parent them in an appropriate professional way, of course, parent them into an identity as a scientist, into an identity as a mathematician, into a curious state where they are safe and skilled to actually engage with the important questions that face us as a society, as a culture, as a species, as this point. And your role is no less than that. You have the opportunity to change the very biological, cultural, cognitive, emotional, social development of a young person when you engage them with them together in a way that makes them feel deeply interested and efficacious in that problem space. So just to give you a little sense of an example of this, right? So this is a song that my daughter wrote when she was, I think, 6 in kindergarten. And it's a song she wrote for her baby brother, whose name is Theodore. She calls him Teddy, right? And you see her, this picture of her she drew with crayon, and she's singing with her little music stand, right? So you get a little bit of the cultural stuff going on in her life. And I won't sing for you, okay? I'll just read, but she says, "Oh, Teddy, we love you more than the whole earth size. As the earth spins every day, we love you as much as usual, but sometimes even more, as you make us proud and happy that you're you." So I have a simple question for you. Is this a song or a poem about this little girl's love for her baby brother? Or is this a song about her budding interest in planetary science, right? We simply are not Frankenstein monsters. And I'm happy to say that now she just graduated from college as a scientist and also an English major at the same time, and is going into a field related to planetary health and immunology, right? She felt the power of the love she had for her baby brother. She felt the awe and power of being on a planet, you know, whirling through space, spinning around with a star shining on one side, making it daytime, and then it goes around the back and it's not shining and it's nighttime, and she's trying to make sense of all this. And those feel like they go together because emotionally they feel the same to think about. Our emotions and our subjective sense of meaning are the conduit for meaningful learning and achievement all the way through to the very most advanced realms of human achievement in science, the arts, the humanities, civic domain. We achieve because we feel a sense of purpose, and we build from that purpose in order to construct knowledge that is not objective, but that is actually integrated into narratives and stories that we believe are good, that we believe are meaningful. And that is the essence of good work. And that is what you are setting up when you teach a young person by introducing them to opportunities to think about the world in scientific or mathematical or computational ways. So emotions are automatic. I didn't have to tell this little daughter of mine, oh, you should lower your blood pressure and your heart rate and breathe slowly and feel warm when you're with your little baby brother that you love, right? That happens automatically because she has learned in that context how to feel. And how has she learned how to feel? By feeling with us, by being together with those around her, and by enjoying the camaraderie, the shared space, the shared experience that is the nature of human consciousness. And that is what you are aiming to try to begin to induce in a classroom context with young people. You're trying to build a community of thinkers who are working together to construct an experience that feels like something, and it feels like something deep and curious and scientific and mathematical. So I'm going to play for you now a short video that's a clip from a NOVA episode where my lab was featured, because it gives you a sense, if you're not familiar with this kind of research, of what fMRI scanning looks like and what the protocol is that we use to try to get the data that I'm about to show you.
Hey, welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm Mary Helen. Nice to meet you.
Since her days as a teacher, University of Southern California neuroscientist Mary Helen Immordino-Yang has been interested in knowing how emotions factor into learning.
I quickly realized that there was very, very little known about the kind of stuff that we really care about in education, like how people become inspired. How do we become interested in things? How do we build curiosity? And how can we support that process?
In trying to identify which parts of the brain are involved in the deepest and most meaningful learning, Immordino-Yang works with teens from troubled neighborhoods.
We're going to be watching stories. We really want to know what you think, so there's no right or wrong answers. These are kids who see a lot of crime, they see a lot of dangerous things, they see a lot of poverty. And we wanted to understand, how do they make meaning of that world around them? This first one is a story about a girl who lives in Swat, Pakistan. And the city was being taken over and basically run by a group called the Taliban. So I want you to watch her when she was 12 years old.
First, she gets them emotionally engaged in a topic by showing them videos about people struggling to overcome adversity.
And I want to become a doctor.
So how does her story make you feel?
This story makes me feel upset how she wants to be a doctor and continue on with her education, but it makes her sad that knowing her journey would be very difficult.
For adolescents, these types of stories can trigger moments of deep reflection.
They come back from those kind of reflective moments with this heightened appreciation of the meaning of the story and what it applies to in their own life and what it means for the nature of the world more broadly.
And it's crazy how it's that powerful.
Whereas we've known that for a long time in education, the neural data are giving us new insights into the mechanics of that process. Over here.
To find out which brain regions are harnessed during reflective emotion, Immordino-Yang monitors the students' brain activity as they re-watch the emotional videos in an fMRI scanner.
Hi, Estella, how you doing in there?
Good.
So we're looking at the movement of the blood flow in her brain as she's watching the stories, and where in her brain is becoming more and less active as she's experiencing these emotions.
She found that the reflective thinking caused by these emotional videos triggers widespread activity throughout the brain.
The most high-level brain states that people experience in the scanner don't just activate high-level systems. They also activate lower-level structures of the brain that are involved in regulating and monitoring your consciousness and your survival.
Immordino-Yang believes that the reason why learning and emotion seem so intimately connected is because complex emotion, like admiration, can activate basic brain functions, like those regulating breathing and heart rate.
We think that the reason that humans' values and belief systems and ideals are such powerful motivators is literally that they're hooking themselves into biomechanical machinery that has evolved to keep us alive over time. So emotions are a critical piece of learning always. Meaningful learning, learning that really matters to you, that changes who you are, and that endures over time, always has an emotional component.
So I would draw upon any of these.
Her research shows that engaging students on an emotional level makes for more powerful learning experiences.
So what you can see from that video and what we learned is being revealed by my little nephew here, right? Looking at his mom, my sister, in the mirror, is that we literally appear to use the substrate of our own consciousness, our own biological survival mechanisms as a kind of ramp or playground in which to experience knowing, in which to come to understand. And that sense of self is the substrate for experiencing and knowing other things, even things that we would not think of as self-related or as emotional or as subjective. Like, for example, that the planet is huge and spins around to make day and night, in the case of my little daughter's poem. So I'm going to take you for a minute into the brain. This is the first. This was the first study of people's subjective experiences of complex social emotions, compassion, admiration for virtue, for skill, right? That we published. That was my postdoc work with Antonio and Hannah Damasio. And I think just a little tour of some of the big findings really generates a kind of appreciation for the literal nature of what I'm saying to you. It's really not that we are Frankenstein monsters with complex thinking over here and emotion over there, but in fact complex thinking is the legacy of the emotional feelings we're able to conjure as we build feelings and narratives that reflect our knowledge, that reflect our experience, that reflect our proclivities and dispositions of mind, and that are emergent within the cultural context in which we live and situate ourselves. So emotionally engaged thinking activates the same brain systems that keep you alive. And I'll just give you a sense of that. So in the scanner, we were asking people to tell us, these data are with adults across a lifespan, and then I'll show you data from teenagers and high school and middle school students in a bit. Basically, people are telling us in real time by pushing buttons from the scanner, because we can't have them talk, it'll introduce artifacts into the data, right? As you're reacting to these true stories of real people's situations from around the world, and saying, you know, how deeply emotionally engaged are you with thinking about this? How strongly do you feel about this? And then we also have these interviews where we ask them, what do you think? So we can understand, you know, what it is that they're thinking about when they see these stories in the scanner. And we've basically, in this analysis that I'm about to show you, made a comparison, a subtraction, in effect. Where is the blood flowing in the brain, reflecting the kind of neural firing that's happening underneath those blood flows, right? When people are saying they are deeply emotionally moved by and engaged with what they're thinking about and really care about what's happening in the story and are really thinking about what it means, as compared to when they say, you know, I don't find this that compelling or interesting. I'm sort of done thinking about it. It's fine. Which, unbeknownst to them, there were stories mixed in that were not meant to be as extraordinary on purpose, in order for people to show us a range of emotional strength and engagement as they were thinking. And again, all the stories throughout all of our experiments are sort of documentary stories that we've put together and compiled. They're all true stories about real people from around the world, which makes it ever so much compelling, especially for teenagers who have radar for trying to be, you know, manipulated emotionally. So what do we see here? Just quickly, what we find first, down underneath my cursor is the spinal cord, right? So we're up in the middle of the back of the roof of your mouth, behind the back of the roof of your mouth. In the brain stem. This is a region of the brain that is operating from far below our conscious control. And it's, you know, we share this with all vertebrates, basically, absolutely essential for life, for consciousness, right? It's sitting in between the whole rest of the brain and your face and body, you know, and is basically the bottleneck through which information passes in both directions. And what we showed is that there were systematic and strong neural activations, even at the level of the brainstem, when people were saying that they were experiencing deep emotional thinking about the story, that they thought it was a very powerful and important thing to be thinking about, and that it was very meaningful to them. We have these in brain up in here, in the midbrain or mesencephalon, in regions that are involved in things like consciousness versus coma, right? You get damage here, you get things like persistent vegetative state, coma, even death, depending on where the damage is and how extensive. Down to, this is the medulla on the bottom of the field of view of the scanner. You know, if you get damage in the medulla, you can't even be kept alive on life support. Short of defibrillating your heart with every beat, you become quickly dysregulated and rapidly physiologically out of parameters that are consistent with life. So what does that tell us about the deep nature of thinking? Thinking does not sort of ride on top of biological survival. It embeds itself in those very same mechanisms. And I would argue that this is why, in fact, you are capable of dedicating the next years of your life to the work that you're about to do. It's because you care enough that it actually becomes a part of your purpose, your survival instinct, your experience of being alive is the psychological sort of after effect of engaging in meaningfully, cognitively and effectively meaningful work. That doesn't happen separate from your own biology. That is a feature of our biology. Anterior insula is a region of the brain. There are two, one on each hemisphere, on each side, right? What do we know about these? Going into this work, we knew from the 1950s, from neurosurgery experiments that were done by Wilder Penfield and his colleagues with epilepsy patients as they tried to cure their intractable epilepsy, that, when you, they would put somebody to sleep, open up their head, wake them back up and kind of poke around in the place that they were going to do the resection surgery to, see how it would affect their cognition and what they would experience before they would cut out a piece, right? And so we learned a lot from those surgeries. And what we know is that when you poke around in the anterior, the front part of the insula, which is what is blazing here in these statistical maps, you basically get a person who vomits or shows other kinds of gastromotoric distress, which I won't describe in polite company. So, what he discovered was that these regions are visceral somatomotor cortex. They are the feeling and regulation of the state of your guts and viscera. When people experience deep, emotionally engaged thinking about complex issues, they are literally playing out that thinking process. Our data would suggest, and now many other sources of data would suggest, on the substrate of the cortical regions that literally also are feeling your guts, right? Poets have had it right all the way along. Let's just skip. So together, the regions that are involved, the anterior middle cingulate is a kind of a region involved in motivation, in pain, in physiological reactivity, like, oh, right? Like, oh, I'm going to step on a snake, or, oh, I know how to do this math problem, right? And is also involved in things like managing thirst. After you drink a glass of water, you're thirsty, your hypothalamus, which is also activated down here, says, oh my gosh, I'm feeling the chemistry of your blood here and it's too concentrated, go get some water, I'm going to make you feel thirsty. You drink a big glass of water, and then you don't feel thirsty anymore. But that water hasn't gotten from your stomach into your bloodstream up to your brain yet. How does your hypothalamus know? It doesn't. Your anterior middle cingulate, which is a very central network region that's controlling attention and physiological regulation in the brain, is actually doing computation and saying like, well, okay, I felt this much water going down and it was this thirsty before and the conditions are like this. From past experience, I'm going to say that's enough. I'm going to make you not feel thirsty anymore, and you don't feel thirsty anymore, right? It's learned motivational states that are situated in patterns of behavior that change the way you feel on the interior. And it's also involved fundamentally in thinking about complex information, in doing math. We have interesting experiments that were done in my lab and in Switzerland, led by a young scientist named Solange de Nervaux, looking at the ways that the anterior middle cingulate is activated in 8 to 12-year-olds as they solve math problems in the MRI scanner and get wrong answers versus right answers, and like go, oh, that's wrong, or oh, that's right, right? And then what happens next in the brain, and how that looks different depending on if those kids were schooled in a Montessori context or a traditional context in which the teacher teaches the math and the students do the problems and give it back, right? And it's different. That's the key issue. It's very different. And then we also have another finding that I think is very important for educators to understand, which at the time was something of a conundrum. We really didn't understand this at first. And now much more is known. Hundreds and hundreds of studies have come out looking at the activation patterns and connectivity patterns dynamically shifting in these regions of the brain that were named by Marcus Raichle and his colleagues at Washington University, St. Louis in like 2001, the so-called brain's default mode network, right? So basically what Raichle and his colleagues did, and others about 2 decades ago now, was to think, okay, well, we're doing lots of work in these newfangled fMRI scanners where we give people stimuli. We shine, snakes in their face, or math problems, or crying babies, or smiling babies, or pornography, or whatever. And then you look at what their brain does in reaction, right? And they thought, what if we put them on the scanner and we give them a super hard task to do, right? Like for those of you who've studied psychology, the n-back task, right? Where you're watching things come at you and you have to remember what happened n times ago and then say, oh, the house was 3 ago and now it's another house, right? It takes tons of outwardly focused attention. What would happen if we just put people in the scanner and gave them that and then gave them nothing and saw what the contrast would be? When you just sit, relax, lay back, don't think about anything in particular, don't fall asleep, just relax and rest, would they discover the brain's so-called default mode? And what they found was that the default was not a kind of quietening of activity around the brain. Instead, sort of paradoxically, there were massive activations in these regions that are now characteristically described in much literature, right in the middle of the back of the head, the middle of the front of the head, some characteristic regions on the side, the parietal lobes too, that become massively activated when you're resting, when you're thinking about nothing in the scanner, right? And how could it be? Because these regions, especially the ones right underneath the letter D in my slide, are some of the most metabolically expensive tissues in the human body. Underneath that D, right down there, uses more glucose and oxygen per unit size, unit time, when you're just daydreaming and resting, as your thigh muscle does in the same size unit of tissue when you're in the middle of running a marathon, right? And the brain does not, biology does not waste energy. How could it be that the most expensive regions of the brain are activated when you're thinking about nothing and deactivated when you do a hard mental task where you have to pay attention? And now what we know, ours was one of the first studies, if not the first study, that actually showed a systematic activation of these regions to a task that was effortful. When we asked people to think about something and do a task in the scanner, what did we ask them to do? Tell me how this story makes you feel, right? These regions are not nothing, they're not resting, they're actually the substrate of self, of reflectivity, of moving yourself out of the here and now in the sense of direct attention to the environment and into a space of narrative, into a space of imagining, into a space of conceptual understanding. It's essential that when kids are learning and you are teaching, you are integrating and moving into spaces where you're making sense of the information. And that sense of the information is being carried out on some of the same neural platforms that also manage your sense of consciousness, your sense of your internal state of body, right? It's when it feels like me to think about these ideas. What this tells us, and what I'm going to show you in some data from kids, is that understanding complex ideas is a very powerful emotional experience for human beings. And that is what you're aiming for in the classroom. So let's take a look back at what Acela said in the scanner beyond what was cut off in the NOVA special. And it gives you a sense of what it looks like for a young person to make this kind of meaning. So she says, and you heard her say, this story makes me feel upset, how she wants to be a doctor, continue on with her education, but it makes her sad knowing her journey would be very difficult, right? I colored that yellow. Yellow is standing for, if you will, direct context-dependent cognition. In the yellow, what she's doing is talking about her reaction to that situation, that girl in Pakistan, that story, right? And that's a legitimate thing, that kind of direct, empathic, a kind of engagement with another person's situation is important for social interactions and for being able to learn, for being able to notice and what's going on around you, and to empathize with people and to learn from those situations. But then she shifts cognitively and emotionally into a different space. She says, and it's crazy how it's that powerful, right? Which signals, the word powerful signals, she's not just with that girl there. There's something powerful that goes beyond that story of that girl there. And she goes on to explain, she says, I mean, it makes me think about my own journey in education, right? Green is coded for her experience, because as she thinks about what this means, she's shifting into this more default mode systems of the brain that are at once context independent, narrative, values-based, out-of-the-box thinking, and the experience of being me. And so these two things go together. It makes me think about my own journey in education, how I want to go to college, hopefully be a scientist someday. And even more, I guess what really hits me is how not everyone's able to get this chance to go forward with their life and get an education or do what they want to do with their life. I mean, it's not right, right? It's not right is not about just being upset about this girl in Pakistan. It's about the fact that such things exist in the world. It's something that's moral now, that's ethical, that's civic. It's broader than just that context. I guess when I think more, yeah, it makes me feel upset that see if she has to sort of go in her own head, right? You can't talk at the same time as you're reflecting, okay? It makes me feel upset that others live in certain parts of the world where they don't want people to learn and they're trying to hold them back. But her story inspires me, right? The experience of thinking about these bigger ideas and implications has the after effect of actually ramping up my own subjective awareness of self. That is the backside of consciousness, right? Work harder. I could work harder so that I could prevent these things from happening, maybe. She doesn't say, I want to go to Pakistan and help her. She says, I want to prevent these things, right? All kinds of injustices from happening. Everyone everywhere should have the chance. I mean, all human beings should be able to live free and choose their life future, right? How much broader, how much more powerful can it be than all human beings everywhere, right? She's moved there by moving herself into this space of deeper understanding, which is incompatible with externally focused, 1, 2, 3, all eyes on me, move your pencil on the paper, like everybody's paying attention here and now. So these networks in the brain basically work kind of like a seesaw, if you want to think about it that way. This is, a model that I'm trying to use to explain this. So, it's like you have the salience, you have the feeling of your guts and your viscera, which is kind of a pivot, neurologically speaking, not physically, right? You're not tipping the brain back and forth, but you're activating certain states of those networked fiber tracks that you saw in Margaret's painting at the beginning, okay? Some of them are coming up, some of them are going down, and they're working in these concerted networked patterns where you're feeling that something matters here. It really hit me, right? It's powerful. And as you do that, you're feeling that on the substrate of your own guts and viscera. And then depending on the nature of that feeling, that power, you dispositionally shift yourself into, wait, I need to pay attention to what happened here, right? I need to watch. She's in pain. She broke her ankle, right? It's all out here. Or I can't look at Malala. It's not about this girl. It's actually about how the world is in general. I need to actually gate and turn inward and kind of go into a freeform, more reflective space. So executive control deactivates as young people are starting to think about what are the broader implications, and they're moving themselves into and out of that space. How do you set up a curriculum that enables young people the opportunities to move themselves? It's like a muscle, to care and then notice and then pay attention to what they need to gather for the information, but then sit back and reflect, why does the ball roll down the ramp? wait a minute, it's actually the same hidden reason why the moon makes tides, right? Why my feet stick to the ground. That's a powerful idea. How do you enable kids coming to recognize those ideas? And what we show in our data, and this was published in March in Nature Scientific Reports, is that transcendent thinking, we're calling it, this thinking that moves you, transcends the current context, this girl, this problem, right, this ramp with this ball rolling down it, to something bigger, gravity, the right to build your own future, right? That the degree to which young people from low SES environments in urban public schools across Los Angeles engaged in such thinking spontaneously in these interviews. They all did it some, so they all can do it, right? But they did it to varying degrees. Some kids were asking us questions. They wanted to know why it's like that, or what could be done, or they thought about the broader implications for something bigger than just this girl in Pakistan, right? As they did that, the propensity to do that literally allowed us to predict the future development of their brain. And this is a picture of the data from those white matter fiber tracks that are connecting the front and the back of the head, the side to side of the head, right? Wiring together the communication. Those tracks that were painted in Margaret's painting are literally growing bigger. So we're not, just to be clear, comparing kids against each other. What kind of brain do you have, right? Mary Helen versus Acela. Instead, we're saying Mary Helen at age 15, Mary Helen's brain at age 17, when I come back and I do the scan again, what is the difference in my two brain scans? How much have I grown myself? This is a map of the growth that is predicted by transcendent thinking. And I should say this is above and beyond the effect of IQ, above and beyond the effect of family socioeconomic status, parents' education level, right? It's something that kids can develop a propensity for, that when they engage in this kind of deeper thinking, when they have a proclivity to try to ask why, understand the systems level, the broader conceptual implications, that is literally, our data would suggest, growing their brain over time. And what we also showed is that the degree of growth, not the kind of brain, but the degree of growth predicted young adult well-being, achievement, and life and relationship satisfaction. Kids liked themselves more when they were in their early 20s, the more growth they'd shown in the brain across this age. So thinking deeply is essentially telling complex emotional stories to yourself, right? You're co-activating these inner networks for autobiographical memory, for out-of-the-box thinking, for free-form sort of narrative, and for emotion and guts and viscera, and for survival, all in these concerted, patterned ways that are playing off one another to produce a propensity for thinking that really makes a difference to the person, to their growth, to their development, but also to what they're capable of accomplishing in the world moving forward. So I just leave you with some questions about this. What does it mean for emotional well-being, for character development, right? What does this mean for the way we use technology, right? When thinking and it gives you the right answer, and then you give the next one, and it gives you the answer, and then, right? Like, that is not facilitative of deep reflective experiences that feel like being a mathematician, though it is a useful way to practice individual skills, right? So you're tipping the seesaw, and you need to be aware of the opportunities for kids to tip back and forth. So I'm just going to show you two videos from one from a teacher working in a study that we've been running that is we're just now publishing these data, right? We have these amazing teachers who are identified across the city, working in low SES needy districts with high proportions of kids of color, first generation kids, immigrant kids, and we looked at the ways that these really highly performing teachers, as identified by their administrators, their principals, we basically went to the school and said, who are your superstars? Like, can we study them, right? And so these gracious teachers invited us into their classrooms. and to film and to watch them and to interview them. And then we also did psychophysiological recording. And then they came to our lab and they did brain scans while they graded their students' work and all these things. And the results are so interesting and complex. But I just want you to notice the different ways that teachers can engage students, keeping in mind what you've seen from about attention, about the way that Acela was talking, right? Like, she, you know, it's very sad. She wants to be a doctor. She can't be, right? You have to know all that. You have to have attended and then memorized what happened, or you can't make that kind of meaning about what Acela did, right? But you also need to go beyond, which requires kind of shutting down that outward vigilance to instead reflect and build something bigger and broader that you take with you, right? So let's just watch two different teachers, and I want you to think about how the kids are engaged and how the learning is being promoted. Not, are the kids engaged? I'm going to tell you, yes, they are, right? I'm not going to have kids sleeping on the desk and show you that and ask you what's wrong with it, right? But I want you to think about the differences in the kind of neurological engagement these youth are showing and the implications for their learning, but also for their development. How does this opportunity to be in this class change over time the way that they come to think about complex information? So in the first video, you're going to see, it's a minute long, you're going to see a teacher teaching a class, a civics class in high school. They're reviewing before the final exam in civics. And this is the class that the teacher has invited us to show us as his example of a really great class that he worked really hard on planning, that he would like us to film.
Oh yeah, this game is Y2K compliant. Little joke for the adults in the room. Question number 1. Where did the decentralized structure of the two major parties originate? A, with the 14th Amendment. B, popular opinion demanded decentralization. C, the federalist nature of the government. D, all of the above. Choose the best answer. Oh my goodness. There's a winter playlist today to go along with the Starship 2000 Holiday Edition review game.
Are we holiday question?
Wow! There will be.
Really? Wow.
Just wait.
What is it? What do you guys think it is?
You got 15 seconds.
You can't do it.
Dump your group, Alex. He's doing it. He's already got. And 5, and 4, and 3, and 2, and whiteboards up, everybody. Let's see those whiteboards. Elizabeth, you have to have it up. When I say up. That was the first one, so I'll give you a little grace there. You too, Brianna. You gotta have it up.
Oh no, that's good.
I know, but for next time, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
bless you. Thank you.
Bless you.
Thank you.
All right, everybody's got it. In Holiday Edition, Starship 2000 says the correct answer. Wait for it. The power emanates from the lightsaber. We got it. It's 1,000 points.
Hit me with the points. There you go.
Okay. What did you notice, right? What kind of engagement? Just think about the seesaw, right? The kids are paying attention, they're engaged, they're guessing an answer, they're figuring it out, they're putting up their board, they're getting the points, right? It's all out here, like, give me more, Mr. Teacher, right? And I will give you back, right? Which is what I mentioned at the very beginning, that kind of transactional kind of learning is located in that executive control network. Now let's watch another teacher in New York City, also working in a low SES school environment. She's teaching Algebra 2. And the kids have been learning, the students have been learning about exponential functions, and she has taken that into a lesson on finance and compound interest. So you're going to watch for 1 minute.
The goal for today is being able to explain compound interest, because that goes back to them meeting their financial goals. The students did a lot of work on calculating retirement, mortgage, and college education costs. I had a financial planner come in to talk about financial planning so that they can understand how to become a financial planner for the families that they were helping. For days, they wrestled with their assigned family's financial situation and had to email back and forth to get more information and clarification. So on one side, they're looking at these very complex mathematical principles of exponential, and they have to switch that and make it conversational in a plan that a layperson can understand and not get caught up in the calculation.
Cost of your home is $440,000 to the principal of interest, and that's going to be the payment to pay it off in 25 years.
So what's different here? What kind of engagement are you seeing on the kids? That kid at the end, when he starts talking to the family he's helping, right? It's somehow not that kind of frantic, ooh, me, give me the points, right? It's a kind of calm, deep confidence in being a financial planner, right? He has taken his math skills, which really matter, because if you make a mistake, this person could buy a house that he can't afford, right? And he's integrated them into his ability to be an active, purposeful civic agent in the world. That is the kind of learning you're going for. I don't have time to show you this amazing example of another school in New York City, an alternative high school called the International Community High School, which is part of the New York Performance Standards Consortium, where they do alternative curriculum with public school students who haven't made it in the standard system for whatever reason. And I just want to show you, highlight one young man's letter to the community that he reads at the end of his math class. He's an immigrant from Sudan who has never had the opportunity to pass a math class before in his life. And he's reading a statement at the end of the class about what happened in that class and why it meant so much to him to be taught in this way that really engaged him differently than just do the math. He says, and you can go watch the full video if you want. There's a link at the bottom of the article I wrote with Doug Connect called Building Meaning Builds Teens' Brains. It's a 15-minute long showcase of the math class. Highly recommend it. He says, I want to be the first person in my family to graduate from college, but I never even imagined I could reach that level of math. Math at my school has helped me to learn mathematically, learn how to think outside the box and different strategies, right? When I was given a problem, I had to think in a new way, research ideas I don't know before. I've spent 2 months working on a problem called walking to the door. This is Zeno's paradox, the idea that you walk halfway to the door. Do you ever get to the door or not? How do you know, right? It led me, he's on a journey with the math, right? It led me to think about limits and the idea of asymptotes, right? It led him to think about ideas. I had to study fractions to be able to think about the problem I had. In other words, can you please teach me the mathematical computational mechanisms again, teacher? Because I need to know them in order to understand this thing, this problem I have, which is important, which is really so exciting because it's an idea that is fascinating, right? I had to study fractions to be able to think about the problem I had. Through doing the problem, I got fascinated by finite and infinite. I was able to connect it to my life. It's uncanny the number of kids in these interviews who say things like, I was able to connect it to my life, or it moved out of school with me, I took it home and was thinking about it, right? Think about that seesaw. I have to think about fractions because I'm fascinated by finite and infinite. Wait, remind me again, how do I do this, right? As the kids are moving from, let me do it so that I can understand this big idea that's very powerful, what happens, I would argue, this is just a theory, but we're working on proving it, is that you're tickling up the pivot point, right? Which is the salience network, which is the feeling of your guts and viscera. It starts to feel like me. And I would argue that relevance in the context of disciplinary learning for adolescents is the experience of feeling like me while I'm thinking about ideas. It's not simply the idea that you can use this in the direct sense in the world. Yes, sure, you should be able to use what you have. You can go, you know, manage your checkbook and your finances well, but it's not, that's relevance with a little r. What you're aiming for is the feeling of being me as I'm thinking about this content. That is relevance with a big R. And that grows the brain. So meaningful learning shifts teachers and students, I would argue, from emotions that are about the outcome, the result, the correct answer, right? To emotions that are about the ideas. I had a problem. I had to understand finite and infinite. When that's the outcome, being fascinated by the notion of infinity, that drives real developmental growth, both in the math, both in the science, in the disciplinary setting, and enables a young person to integrate their knowledge into civic action, like the way you saw with the young man giving advice on how to buy a home, right, to another person from his community. And our data show it actually stabilizes and encourages brain development that is associated with well-being and stability and relationship satisfaction and achievement over time. If you're interested in learning more, you can follow up. The lab where I do my work that I founded is called CANDLE, the Center for Affective Neuroscience, Development, Learning, Education at the University of Southern California. And thank you.